Violence doesn't always arrive with warning. Sometimes it creeps through a town, unchallenged, feeding off silence until someone refuses to stay quiet. They saw an easy target. A black woman, new to the neighborhood, raising a son alone. When they stormed her home, taking what they pleased, smashing what they didn't, they expected fear and compliance. But they didn't know she was a Navy SEAL, trained to dismantle threats and conditioned to survive. The mistake they made wasn't just underestimating her. It was thinking they were in control. By the time the dust settled, the gang would be broken, their leaders would fall, and they would learn what is meant to mess with a mother with everything to lose if she failed. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe. The moving truck rumbled to a stop in front of a modest single-story house, its tires crunching against the gravel driveway. The air was thick with southern humidity, the heat rolling in waves over the quiet suburban street. Zariah Kaylani stepped out first, her dark, unshaken eyes sweeping across the neighborhood like a soldier surveying new territory. She wasn't paranoid, just prepared. Azael, her 18-year-old son, climbed out after her, his slim frame carrying the kind of tension that belonged to someone far older. He hesitated before reaching for a box in the truck bed, stealing glances at the houses lined up along the cul-de-sac. The neighborhood was pristine. Manicured lawns, symmetrical homes painted in warm, neutral colors, and porches adorned with rocking chairs that had likely never known an unfamiliar visitor. But beneath that perfect exterior, there was something else, something unwelcome. The silence told her everything. No warm greetings, no curious neighbors offering help with the move. Just the cold weight of eyes on their backs. Across the street, an older man leaned against the railing of his porch, a cigarette hanging loose from the corner of his thin lips. His expression wasn't openly hostile, but it wasn't friendly either. A few houses down, a middle-aged couple stood by their mailbox, whispering to each other while they cast quick, judgmental glances in Zariah's direction. It wasn't unfamiliar. She had encountered it before, stationed overseas, walking through villages where the locals saw her as an outsider, a disruption to their routine. Except this wasn't a foreign war zone. This was supposed to be home. Azael shifted uncomfortably, lowering his gaze to the ground as he stacked the boxes by the door. He wasn't naive. He had grown up understanding that some places weren't meant for people like them. Zariah had chosen this town for its quiet, its safety. But now, standing here with the weight of unseen stares pressing down on her shoulders, she wondered if she had made a mistake. Then she saw him. A man, mid-50s, stocky with a gut that suggested a former life of fitness, stepped out of the house next door. His pale blue polo shirt stretched slightly over his stomach, and his stiff khaki pants looked like they hadn't been worn in the sun a day in their life. He wasn't looking at her, yet. Instead, he was focused on the camera system he was mounting to his front porch, adjusting the angle carefully. The red light blinked, indicating it was live. Zariah narrowed her eyes. He turned then, slow and deliberate, as if he wanted her to know he had done it on purpose. The message was clear. "We're watching you." She didn't react, didn't give him the satisfaction of flinching or looking away. She had spent years training under worse conditions, standing firm under the stares of men who wanted to see her break. A man like him wasn't going to rattle her. She grabbed the last box and nudged Azael toward the front door. "Let's get inside," she murmured, her voice calm but carrying an edge. Inside, the house was nothing special, just walls and floors, space meant to be lived in. But to Zariah, it was something more. It was a fresh start, a place to breathe again. The scent of new paint lingered in the air, blending with the warm wood polish of the floors. Sunlight poured in through the large windows in the living room, casting golden slants across the walls. It had potential. Azael stood in the middle of the room, shifting from foot to foot, his hands stuffed deep in his hoodie pockets. "They don't want us here," he muttered, finally saying what they were both thinking. Zariah set the box down and rolled her shoulders, the tension in them a familiar weight. "They don't get a say," she replied, unwrapping a kitchen knife and sliding it into the drawer with a little more force than necessary. Azael hesitated, watching her. He had seen that look before, when she used to come back from deployments, when the world was still something she had to fight against. "You always say that," he murmured. Because it was true. That night, after the last box had been unpacked, Zariah sat by the living room window with a cup of tea, staring at the street beyond. The neighborhood was quiet now, almost unnervingly so. Azael had gone to bed, his door shut, music playing softly from the other side. She should have been resting too, but sleep had become something foreign to her long ago. Across the street, the man with the cigarette was still out on his porch, watching, not even trying to hide it. She exhaled slowly and leaned back into the chair, her fingers tightening around the handle of her mug. The morning air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and the faint, lingering aroma of gasoline from a lawnmower down the street. The neighborhood was as pristine as ever. Every house neatly lined with symmetrical flower beds, white fences and mailboxes standing at rigid attention. It looked like the kind of place where nothing ever went wrong, where people left their doors unlocked and waved at their neighbors every morning. But Zariah knew better. She stepped out onto the porch, adjusting the strap of her shoulder bag as she locked the door behind her. Across the yard, the neighbor from 2 houses down, Ellen Caldwell, was already making her way over. Ellen was in her early 50s, the type of woman who dressed like she was always on her way to a church fundraiser. Her blonde hair was meticulously curled, and the cardigan draped over her shoulders looked as though it had been ironed that morning. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile Zariah had seen before, the polite, slightly forced expression of someone trying to appear warm while masking curiosity. "Good morning," Ellen called out, pausing at the edge of the driveway as if testing the waters. Zariah nodded. "Morning." Ellen's gaze flicked to the house before settling on Zariah again. "I meant to come by sooner, but, well, you know how life gets busy. Moving is such a hassle, isn't it?" She glanced at the house again, her expression unreadable. "It's just you and your husband?" Zariah felt the subtle probe beneath the casual question. Ellen wanted to know who they were, how they fit into the neighborhood's carefully curated image. She wanted to place them in a box, determine if they were a threat or simply an unfortunate presence to be tolerated. "No husband," Zariah answered evenly. "Just me and my son." Ellen's smile faltered for half a second. So quick, it could have been missed. "Oh," she said, her voice softening. "That must be difficult." There it was. The pity, the unspoken, how do you manage? The assumption that because there was no man in the house, things must be harder, less stable, more incomplete. Zariah kept her expression neutral. "We manage." Ellen tilted her head slightly, as if assessing her. "Your son? I saw him heading to school yesterday." "Yeah, Azael." A glimmer of something flickered in Ellen's eyes. Concern. Maybe even an attempt at genuine kindness. That's a tough age for boys, especially without a father. Zariah's jaw tightened. She knew it wasn't meant to be an insult, but there was something about the way Ellen said it, something laced with unspoken assumptions. She had heard it before. Boys without fathers, as if the absence of a man in their home somehow meant something was missing. Before Zariah could respond, Ellen's expression brightened again, as if she had just remembered something. "Well, if you ever need anything, we're just a few houses down. It's good to have neighbors you can rely on." Zariah didn't trust that for a second, but she nodded. "Appreciate it." Ellen lingered for a moment before offering one last smile and heading back across the street. As she walked away, Zariah could almost feel the weight of the unspoken words between them. She wasn't sure if Ellen was trying to be kind or just fishing for gossip. Either way, it didn't matter. She had bigger things to worry about. The afternoon heat was suffocating by the time she pulled up in front of the house again. Azael sat slouched in the passenger seat, one earbud in, eyes glued to his phone. His silence wasn't unusual. He had never been the chatty type. But there was a certain weight to it today. "School all right?" Zariah asked, her fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel. Azael shrugged, still looking at his screen. It's fine. Fine. She hated that word. It never actually meant anything. She exhaled, shifting the car into park. You know, you don't have to let people walk all over you. That got his attention. His eyes flicked up to her, a shadow of annoyance creeping in. I didn't. She studied his face for a moment. He wasn't telling her something. Azael unbuckled his seatbelt and grabbed his backpack, pushing the door open. Can we just go inside? Zariah sighed, deciding to let it go. For now, she stepped out, adjusting the bag on her shoulder as she moved toward the front door. Something felt off. Her footsteps slowed as they reached the porch. The air was too still. Azael didn't notice. He was already reaching for the door handle when she caught his wrist, stopping him. Mom, what? She held up a finger, silencing him. Then she heard it. Something inside the house. Movement. The faint shuffle of feet. A crash. Laughter. Zariah's pulse slowed, her mind shifting into the kind of focus that had been drilled into her for years. She was trained for moments like this, for the split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. She reached into her bag, her fingers closing around the handle of her knife. She had left her firearm locked in the safe, thinking she wouldn't need it in a place like this. She had been wrong. She looked at Azael. His wide eyes mirrored the realization sinking into his chest. Go to the car, she murmured. His breath hitched. But now, for once, he didn't argue. He backed away slowly, his face pale, his fingers gripping the strap of his backpack so tight his knuckles turned white. Zariah exhaled, bracing herself. Then, with steady hands, she pushed the door open. Chaos greeted her. The living room was a wreck. Couch cushions shredded, bookshelves overturned, the coffee table smashed in two. A group of men stood in the middle of it all, laughing as they tossed items to each other like it was some kind of game. One of them, tall, lean, a mess of greasy blonde hair, was holding a framed picture of Azael. He studied it with amusement, before casually tossing it over his shoulder. The glass shattered against the hardwood floor. Zariah felt something cold coil around her spine. The men hadn't noticed her yet. She took a slow step forward, her voice even. Put it back. Silence. 4 heads turned toward her. For a moment, they just stared, like they hadn't expected to get caught. Then the blonde one grinned. Well, look at that. He gestured toward the others. She's home. A shorter, stockier man, shaved head, a long scar running down his jaw, leaned against the broken bookshelf. This your place, sweetheart? His voice was laced with mockery, the words rolling off his tongue slow and deliberate. Zariah ignored him, her eyes flicking between them, assessing. 4 men, none armed, at least not visibly. They weren't professionals, but they were dangerous. She exhaled, letting her fingers flex around the knife handle. Her voice was steady. You can leave, or I can make you. That made them laugh. The blonde one, the apparent ringleader, spread his arms out like he was inviting a fight. I'd love to see you try. Zariah's muscles coiled, the air in the room thick with tension. She had been here before, standing on the edge of violence, waiting for the inevitable. They thought she was weak. They thought she was just another single mother in a house she didn't belong in. They had no idea what was coming. The laughter echoed in her ears, coarse and mocking, the kind that came from men who believed they had nothing to fear, who had spent their whole lives believing in their own invincibility. Zariah stood motionless in the wreckage of her own living room, taking in the destruction around her with a slow, measured breath, the weight of the situation sinking into her muscles like a slow burn. The sharp scent of cigarette smoke mingled with the musty odor of spilled beer, broken wood, and something else. Something metallic and faintly familiar. Blood, maybe. Glass crunched beneath their boots as they stood there, waiting for her to react, waiting for her to break. They weren't worried. They weren't even taking her seriously. That was their first mistake. The blonde one, the one who seemed to be in charge, stepped forward with an arrogance so thick it rolled off of him in waves, his dirty sneakers dragging over the shattered frame of Azael's picture without a second thought. His grin widened as he looked her up and down, his fingers brushing lazily over the handle of a hunting knife at his hip. his posture casual, confident, as if he had already won. "Lady, I think you're confused about how this works," he said, amusement dripping from his tone as he gestured toward the destruction around them, the overturned furniture, the broken shelves, the torn fabric of her couch. Zariah didn't answer, her expression giving away nothing, her body still, her hands loose at her sides, her breathing controlled and even. The blonde one smirked and continued, his voice slow and deliberate, as if he were speaking to a child. "See, this ain't just a house anymore. This here's a message. You and that little boy of yours? You don't belong here." The others chuckled at that, their postures easy, relaxed, their amusement thinly veiling something more dangerous beneath the surface. A second man, stockier, with a long, jagged scar running down his jaw, leaned lazily against the broken bookshelf, tapping a cigarette out of a crumpled pack before lighting it with the kind of slow, practiced indifference that only came with experience. "Ain't nothing personal, sweetheart," he muttered around the cigarette, the words muffled by the roll of smoke between his lips. "Just trying to remind folks that some places ain't meant for everyone." Zariah exhaled slowly, her fingers twitching once before settling. Control, timing, focus. She had been trained for moments like this, trained to assess, to wait, to let her opponent believe he was in control before dismantling him in the most efficient way possible. There was no need to rush, no need to lash out without precision. If she had learned anything in the years of war zones and conflict, it was that the most dangerous predator was the one that knew how to be patient. The blonde one, still smirking, took another step forward. She moved fast. In one fluid motion, Zariah reached out, her fingers clamping around his wrist in an iron grip, twisting sharply with practiced precision until she felt the satisfying pop of tendons straining beneath his skin. His cocky smirk barely had time to vanish before a choked grunt escaped his lips, his entire body lurching forward as his knife clattered uselessly to the floor. She didn't hesitate. The moment his balance shifted, she drove her knee into his ribs with enough force to send him staggering backward, his breath leaving him in a sharp, strangled wheeze. For the first time, she saw it flicker across his face. Fear. The shift in the air was immediate. The other three lunged into action, their previous amusement snapping into something sharper, something laced with anger and disbelief. They hadn't expected her to fight back, hadn't expected resistance, hadn't even considered the possibility that she would be anything other than an easy target. Scarface moved first, the cigarette falling from his lips as he swung at her with the kind of brute force that suggested he relied more on power than precision. She ducked under the wild strike, her muscles shifting with the motion, and in the same breath, she reached down, grabbing a jagged piece of the shattered picture frame from the floor. Glass sliced cleanly across his cheek as she swung it upward, the sharp edge cutting deep. Blood sprayed across the room in thick droplets, and he let out a howl of rage, clutching his face as he stumbled backward. The stocky one, the brute, was already moving, barreling toward her with the kind of unrelenting force that came from someone used to overpowering their opponents through sheer size and strength. She twisted away, her foot planting against the floorboards as she redirected his momentum, sending him crashing into the side table with a heavy, splintering crack. But they were learning. She barely had time to recover before Scarface came back at her, his movements sloppier now, fueled by anger more than anything else. He caught the edge of her shirt, yanking her backward before she could fully dodge, and the sudden shift in weight sent her off balance. The moment of hesitation was all the stocky one needed. The brass knuckle gleamed just before the hit landed. Pain exploded across her ribs, sharp and immediate, her breath hitching as the impact stole the air from her lungs. She barely had time to register it before another blow came, this one catching her just beneath the jaw, the metallic taste of blood pooling at the back of her throat before she had even hit the floor. Her ears rang, her vision swimming, but she forced herself to move, forced herself to get up. She twisted sharply, her legs sweeping Scarface's feet out from under him, sending him sprawling onto the shattered remains of the coffee table. She could feel the strain in her muscles, the burning ache where the brass knuckle had connected, but she didn't stop. She wouldn't stop. But she was slowing. The blonde one was back on his feet now, his previous arrogance replaced with cold, simmering rage. "You think you're tough?" he spat, wiping the blood from his mouth. "You're just a damn—" She didn't let him finish. Zariah surged forward, her fist colliding with his jaw before he could get another word out, the impact sending him staggering into the bookshelf. The moment of triumph was short-lived. A hand grabbed her from behind, thick fingers wrapping around her throat before she could react, yanking her backward with enough force to send her crashing against the wall. Her skull hit wood, her vision flashing white for a split second before pain bloomed at the base of her neck. Then the blows came. A brutal punch to her stomach that knocked the wind out of her. A kick to her ribs that sent her sprawling to the ground. Another punch, this one to her temple, turning the world into a blur of shadows and pain. She gasped, her body resisting, muscles coiling, but they weren't stopping this time. They were done playing. The blonde one crouched beside her, his fingers digging into her hair as he yanked her head up, forcing her to meet his gaze. His face was bloodied, his expression twisted with rage, his breath coming in short, labored pants. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" he hissed. Zariah's fingers twitched. She needed to move. She needed to get up. Then she heard it. The front door creaked open, the hinges groaning against the weight of movement. The sound cut through the haze of pain, sharp and immediate, pulling her back into focus. The men hesitated, turning toward the entryway, their grip on her loosening slightly. Footsteps, slow at first, then more certain, pressing into the floor with purpose. Then came the voice. Low, shaken, angry. "Get the hell off her." Zariah didn't need to look to know who it was. Azael. He had been outside, just like she had told him. But he hadn't left. He had seen everything. He had watched them beat her, watched them laugh, watched them think they had won. And now he was standing there, facing them. He wasn't running. A heavy silence filled the room, thick and suffocating, stretching out between them like a wire pulled too tight. The men turned toward the door, their momentary distraction giving Zariah just enough time to register the shape of her son standing there, his hands clenched into fists, his breath short and uneven. She could see it in his face. Fear, anger, hesitation, and something else. He had never been in a fight, never thrown a punch, never had to stand his ground against men like this, but he wasn't backing down, even though he looked like he wanted to run. Azael had just done the hardest part. Stepping forward, Zariah forced herself to move. Scarface was the first to react, his sneer twisting into something amused, his body shifting as if he had already decided that whatever Azael thought he was about to do, it wouldn't matter. "Boy, you got no idea what you just walked into," he muttered, his fingers flexing like he was already picturing wrapping them around Azael's throat. Zariah didn't let him get that far. She surged forward from the floor, slamming her elbow into his knee with everything she had left. The joint snapped backward at an unnatural angle, and Scarface let out a sharp, guttural scream, stumbling as his leg buckled. She didn't stop. Using the momentum from the strike, she twisted her body, launching upward, her palm cracking against his nose with a brutal force that sent him sprawling onto the floor. Blood gushed instantly from the wound, pooling into his mouth as he choked on his own breath. The stocky one lunged at Azael, seeing an easier target. Azael barely had time to react, but instinct, or maybe pure adrenaline, sent him moving on reflex. He ducked, shifting his weight just enough to avoid the swinging fist. And before the man could recover, Zariah grabbed the edge of the broken coffee table and drove it straight into his ribs. The heavy wooden piece crunched against flesh and bone. The man let out a strangled curse, stumbling backward, gasping as pain cut through his body. But the blonde one, The ringleader, the one who had been smiling before, had recovered. And this time, he wasn't playing anymore. He grabbed Azael by the hoodie, yanking him back hard. Zariah saw red. She launched herself toward him, her body moving faster than the pain, faster than the exhaustion setting in. She grabbed the back of his head and slammed it against the wall, his skull making a sickening crack as it connected with the drywall. He let go of Azael immediately, staggering, stunned, disoriented. She didn't let up. Zariah grabbed him by the collar, pulling him forward just enough before she drove a savage knee into his stomach. He let out a guttural, wheezing gasp, his body folding in on itself. Azael, still shaken but catching on quickly, didn't waste the moment. He grabbed one of the broken wooden chair legs from the floor and swung it as hard as he could, striking the man across the side of the head. The impact sent him collapsing onto the ground, motionless. The stocky one, still holding his ribs, tried to charge at them again, but this time Azael was ready. He threw the broken chair leg like a spear, aiming low, hitting the man's shin. He fell forward, his body lurching, and Zariah stepped in, slamming her foot into his face before he could lift himself back up. Another crack, another body down. Scarface, still clutching his ruined leg, let out a ragged breath. His body twitched, like he was trying to force himself to get up. But his knee was done, his face was covered in blood, and he wasn't going anywhere. The gang wasn't laughing anymore. The blonde one groaned, struggling to roll onto his side, his movements sluggish and uncoordinated. He blinked up at Zariah, realizing too late that the fight was over. They had lost. They had walked in here thinking it would be easy, thinking they would teach her a lesson, but now they were the ones bleeding, the ones struggling to breathe, the ones realizing they had made the wrong call. The stocky one grabbed the blonde one's arm, yanking him up. "We gotta go, now!" Scarface tried to crawl away, his body dragging across the broken glass and debris, but his leg gave out completely, leaving him sprawled on the floor, his breath hitching. The others didn't wait for him. They stumbled out the door, dragging themselves toward their car, their bravado shattered. Scarface reached for them, his fingers clawing at the air, his voice hoarse, pained. "Wait!" But they didn't. They left him. Zariah watched them disappear down the street, tires screeching as they peeled off, their pride bleeding out onto the pavement. Then, slowly, she turned back to Scarface, who was still there, still gasping, still broken. Azael stood beside her, his breathing uneven, his hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline still running through him. He looked down at the man on the floor, then back at his mother. Scarface stared up at her, his chest rising and falling erratically, blood dripping from his mouth, pain evident in his features. His eyes flicked between them, realization dawning on his face. He was alone, and now he was the one left behind. The sound of sirens came too late, long after the real fight had ended. The wail of approaching authority ringing hollow against the quiet hum of the neighborhood. The police cruiser pulled up with slow, deliberate control, its headlights cutting across the wreckage of Zariah's living room as it rolled to a stop just outside. She exhaled sharply, her body still running on adrenaline, her ribs aching from every breath she took. For the first time since the fight had started, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, finally, this was over. Sheriff Baylor Kinlan stepped out of the car, his movements calm, unhurried, his face unreadable. His uniform was neat, the tan fabric pressed and unstained, his belt hanging heavy with a holstered gun that looked untouched. His expression gave nothing away, but the way he looked over the house, the blood on the floor, the overturned furniture, the man still groaning in pain near her feet. There was something in his gaze that made her pause. Azael was still behind her, his breathing sharp, his hands curled into fists at his sides, his entire body rigid with the aftershock of what had just happened. He had barely spoken since the fight ended, but she could feel the way his energy shifted when the sheriff stepped into the house, when those eyes turned toward them. Baylor's gaze swept across the room, taking in every detail. His expression didn't change when he saw Scarface still down, still gasping, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He barely reacted to the splintered remains of the coffee table, to the shattered picture frames, to the blood smeared across the floor. When he finally spoke, it wasn't what she expected. "Well, well, well," he muttered, shaking his head, sounding more amused than anything else. "This is one hell of a mess." Zariah opened her mouth to speak, to tell him what had happened, but something in his tone stopped her. Baylor let out a small chuckle, like this was nothing more than an inconvenience to him, like the sight of her torn-apart home was just another part of his day. He nudged Scarface's leg with the toe of his boot, the man groaning weakly in response, his face still twisted with pain. "That one's gonna need an ambulance," Baylor said, scratching at the stubble on his chin. "You did a real number on him." Zariah frowned, the words settling strangely in her chest. He wasn't asking if she was okay. He wasn't asking if Azael was hurt. She swallowed hard, straightening her stance, her breath steadying. "He broke into my house." Baylor exhaled, tilting his head slightly, as if weighing that statement, as if there was anything about this situation that required consideration. Then, with a slow, exaggerated sigh, he spoke again. "Trespassing, destruction of property, attempted assault." His voice carried something light, something mocking. "Maybe, but you beat that boy half to death. People in this town won't like that." Zariah blinked. For a moment, she thought she had misheard him, that the ringing in her ears had twisted his words into something else. But the way he looked at her, the way his expression didn't shift, told her that he had said exactly what he meant. Her pulse slowed, the weight of it settling in. They weren't the victims in his eyes. They never had been. She felt Azael shift behind her, his breathing still unsteady. His voice was small when he finally spoke, cracking slightly around the edges. "Are we going to get in trouble?" Zariah didn't turn to look at him, her gaze locked on the sheriff, on the way his posture remained loose, unconcerned. Her ribs ached, her lips stung, and the realization of it all pressed into her bones like something cold. "No." She said it because Azael needed to hear it, but she wasn't sure anymore. Baylor studied her for a moment longer, his gaze flicking briefly to Azael before shifting back. If he noticed the way her shoulders tensed, the way her fingers twitched slightly, he didn't acknowledge it. Instead, he let out another breath, shaking his head slightly, like he had already decided this was more trouble than it was worth. "I'll call an ambulance," he muttered. "Get him out of here before he starts whining too much. You'll want to clean this mess up quick." He started to turn, pausing just as he reached the doorway. His eyes flicked back to her, his mouth curling slightly at the corner. "Oh, and Miss Kaylani?" Zariah didn't blink, her expression unreadable, though her body remained tense. "What?" Baylor's smirk deepened, though there was no friendliness in it, only the kind of quiet warning that wasn't meant to sound like a threat, but carried the weight of one all the same. "You might want to rethink staying here. People don't forget things like this." He didn't wait for a response, didn't seem to care if she had anything to say. Instead, he turned and walked back to his cruiser at the same slow, deliberate pace, like he had all the time in the world, like he had done what he came to do, like the sight of her wrecked home and the blood on her floor didn't matter in the slightest. The door of the cruiser shut with a dull finality, and a moment later, the red and blue lights flickered once before disappearing down the street, leaving nothing behind except the distant hum of an engine fading into the night. Zariah remained standing in the silence, her breathing steady but deep, her hands flexing at her sides, the dull ache in her ribs settling in now that the rush of adrenaline had begun to wear off. She felt the weight of everything pressing in at once, the fight, the pain, the realization that no one was coming to help them, that whatever happened next, they were going to have to handle it alone. Azael stood beside her, his posture stiff, his face pale, his fingers twitching like he wasn't sure what to do with them. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke, hesitant in a way she hadn't heard before. "Mom, what do we do now?" Zariah exhaled, her gaze still fixed on the empty street where the sheriff's cruiser had disappeared. The stillness of the neighborhood settling heavy around them, the weight of the night stretching long and uncertain. She didn't answer immediately, not because she didn't have one, but because the truth of it sat heavy on her tongue. Something unspoken, yet fully understood. They had no one else to rely on. They were on their own. The night was thick with humidity, the kind that clung to the skin and made the air feel heavier than it should. Inside a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of town, a place that had no name on the outside because the people who came here already knew where to go, the air was thick with cigarette smoke, cheap whiskey, and the low murmur of voices that never carried beyond the walls. It was the kind of place where men sat in silence for hours, nursing grudges alongside their drinks, waiting for someone to say something worth acting on. Tonight, all eyes were on Ronan Audric, the leader of the Hounds of Perdition. As he stood near the back of the room, his fingers tapping a slow rhythm against the wooden surface of the pool table, his eyes narrowed at the men sitting across from him. His patience was running thin. His younger brother, Severin, slumped in a chair nearby, his body still stiff with pain, his leg wrapped in a thick brace, a permanent reminder of what had happened inside Zariah Kailani's home. His face was swollen, one eye nearly shut, his lips still cracked from where her fists had connected with bone. He was barely keeping himself upright, the weight of his injuries forcing him to lean against the table for support. But none of that stopped the anger burning behind his bruised face. Ronan had barely said a word since Severin had told him what happened, since he had heard how a woman, a single mother, had taken his brother apart and left him broken while the rest of his men had fled like cowards. The longer he sat with the story, the more his jaw tightened, his fingers curling into fists at his sides, his breathing deep and controlled, like he was holding something back that would eventually find its way out. "You're telling me," he finally said, his voice low, deliberate, his eyes shifting from Severin to the rest of the men who had been there that night, "that a woman and her kid did this?" Severin clenched his jaw, looking away, his hands tightening against the armrests of his chair. "She wasn't just some woman," he muttered, the words bitter as they left his mouth. "She moved like she'd done it before." Ronan inhaled slowly, tapping the pool cue against his boot, before tossing it onto the table with a dull thud. His men were still avoiding his gaze, shifting uncomfortably in their seats, each one waiting for someone else to step forward, to offer an excuse, to explain why they had come back empty-handed, while his brother had been carried out of that house barely able to stand. None of them had an answer. The blond one, his face still bruised, cleared his throat and leaned forward slightly, as if that might soften what he was about to say. "She got the jump on us, boss. We didn't know she could fight like that. And the kid," Ronan's fingers twitched. The mention of Azael made his expression darken, but he said nothing, only rolled his shoulders back before exhaling through his nose. He didn't believe in coincidences, and a woman fighting back was one thing, but a kid? "She took you apart," he muttered, his voice quieter now, as if he were saying it more to himself than to the room. Then he shook his head, scoffing under his breath. "And you ran." No one spoke. Severin's fingers curled into his palm, the veins in his forearm standing out against his skin. He hated this. Hated sitting there while they talked about what had happened to him. Hated the way Ronan was looking at him now, like he had done something wrong by not finishing the fight. But he hadn't been given a choice. She had destroyed his knee. He would never walk the same way again. Ronan studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before he turned back to the men across from him. When he finally spoke again, his voice was calm, steady, the kind of tone that was more dangerous than shouting because it meant he had already made a decision. "I want her to be afraid every time she steps outside. I want that kid to know that what he did means he doesn't get to walk around like nothing happened. And I want the next person who thinks about standing up to us to see exactly what that gets them." No one hesitated this time. There were nods, murmurs of agreement, a slow build of something mean beneath the surface, something that had been waiting for permission to act. Ronan reached for the half-empty whiskey glass in front of him, bringing it to his lips before glancing back at Severin, who had said nothing for a while now. "We'll handle it," Ronan murmured, the words more of a promise than reassurance. Severin didn't answer, but the way his fingers twitched slightly against the table was enough. The first sign of trouble came early the next morning. Zoraya had barely slept, her ribs aching with every breath she took. The dull throb in her temple a lingering reminder of every hit she had taken the night before. The house felt smaller now, as if the walls had moved in closer overnight, as if everything had shifted, while she had been too exhausted to notice. Every sound, every creak of the floorboards made her muscles tense, made her reach instinctively for something that could be used as a weapon. She wasn't used to feeling like this. The sound of Azael's voice pulled her from her thoughts, the urgency in his tone enough to make her push through the stiffness in her body as she pulled herself out of bed. "Mom," he called from outside, his voice tight, uneasy. "You need to see this." She stepped onto the porch, the morning light casting sharp shadows across the yard, illuminating the damage that hadn't been there the night before. All 4 tires on her car had been slashed, deep, deliberate cuts carved into the rubber, the kind that weren't meant to send a message, but to make sure she had no way to leave. She let out a slow breath, her eyes scanning the street, taking in the way everything else looked untouched, as if the rest of the world had been left alone while only her house had been singled out. Then her gaze fell on something else, something darker near the steps of the porch. Azael swallowed hard. "Jesus!" he muttered under his breath, his face pale. A raccoon, its body limp, its fur dark with blood, had been left just feet from their door. It wasn't torn apart the way it would have been if another animal had done it, and the way it had been positioned, facing the house, its body set neatly near the mailbox, told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't about scaring her. It was about control. She crouched slowly, examining the body, her fingers resting lightly on her knees as she exhaled through her nose. This was Ronan's message, not Severin's. Severin had been reckless, had underestimated her, had acted out of anger, but Ronan was different. He wanted her to know that he had taken his time with this, that he had planned it. Azael shifted beside her, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He wasn't asking what it meant, because he already knew. Zoraya stood after a moment, her fingers pressing against the sharp ache in her ribs, her gaze still locked on the street ahead. The sheriff wouldn't do anything. She knew that now. But if Ronan thought this was going to be enough to make her afraid, he was wrong. She had spent years learning how to fight, how to protect, how to anticipate an attack before it happened. They wanted her to feel like a victim. She wasn't about to let them have that. The air inside the house had changed. There was no more uncertainty, no more waiting for something to happen, no more hoping that whatever came next would be on her terms. Zoraya had spent too much of her life preparing for moments like this, too much time training for worst-case scenarios, too many hours perfecting the art of staying alive to let hesitation decide what she would do next. The threats had come, the warnings had been made, and the sheriff had made it clear that there would be no help coming. That meant she had only one option left. She had to be ready when they came back. She moved through the house with a practiced efficiency, her body aching from the bruises she hadn't yet given herself the time to recover from, the sharp pain in her ribs a constant reminder of just how close she had come to losing that fight. But she didn't let it slow her down, didn't let it pull her away from what needed to be done. Every step was deliberate, every decision calculated, as she mapped out every inch of the space, noting every entry point, every blind spot, every piece of furniture that could be turned into cover or repositioned for better defense. The locks on the doors weren't enough. Not anymore. She reinforced them, installing deadbolts where there had been none, nailing thick wooden planks across the back door to make sure it couldn't be kicked in. The windows were another vulnerability, each one a possible breach point, but she knew how to handle those too. She removed the old latches and replaced them with stronger reinforced locks, then cut lengths of steel pipe to wedge against the frames, ensuring that even if someone tried to force them open, they wouldn't budge. She wasn't just securing the house, she was turning it into a fortress. She pulled out the weapons she had kept locked away, the ones she had never needed until now. The Glock she kept in the bedroom safe was the first thing she checked, ejecting the magazine, sliding it back into place, pressing the barrel against her palm to make sure everything was intact. She moved it to the kitchen, where it would be easier to reach if she needed it. The shotgun, an old but well-maintained Remington 870, was taken from the closet and placed behind the couch, within reach but out of sight. She wasn't just relying on firearms either. She had knives, heavy tools, even a hammer that could crush bone if swung hard enough. She set traps, small but effective ones, designed to disorient and slow down anyone who got too close. Fishing line was stretched across doorways at ankle height, a simple trick that could send an intruder sprawling before they even realized what had happened. Nails, bent at just the right angle, were placed beneath the windows where they would be hidden in the shadows, waiting for anyone stupid enough to try climbing in. This wasn't paranoia. This was preparation. And if they thought she was going to wait for them to decide when the next fight would happen, they were wrong. She was ready. Azael watched from the doorway, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, his expression unreadable as he took in everything his mother was doing. He hadn't said much since that morning, since they had found the slashed tires and the dead raccoon, since she had told him, in a tone that left no room for argument, that they needed to be ready. He had nodded, followed her instructions when she asked for something, but she could see the way he hesitated, the way his body stiffened every time she reached for a weapon, the way his eyes lingered on the gun she had placed on the kitchen counter as if he was waiting for it to disappear. She knew what he was thinking before he even said it. "You're really going to kill them," he murmured. Not quite a question, not quite an accusation, but something that hovered in between. Zariah didn't look up from where she was setting another tripwire near the hallway entrance, her fingers moving swiftly as she tied the knots, making sure they were tight enough to hold. "If they break in again," she said simply, "they won't be walking out." Azael exhaled through his nose, his shoulders shifting slightly, his fingers tightening around the fabric of his hoodie. He didn't look at her as he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I don't know if I can do that." Zariah finally turned to face him, her gaze steady, her hands resting against her thighs as she studied him for a moment. He was still shaking, barely noticeable, but she caught it, the slight tremor in his fingers, the way he kept swallowing like he was trying to push down something that wouldn't go away. She walked toward him, slow but deliberate, stopping just a foot away before speaking. "It's not about wanting to," she said, her voice calm, measured, as if she were explaining something simple, something necessary. "It's about surviving." Azael lifted his chin slightly, his jaw tight, but she could see the conflict in his eyes, the part of him that wasn't sure what kind of person this would make him if he went through with it. She sighed, glancing past him, staring out the window where the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the yard. "When I was deployed, I met a man who hesitated when it mattered," she said, her voice quieter now, almost reflective. "He wasn't weak, he wasn't a coward, he just didn't want to take a life if he could avoid it." She let the words settle before continuing. "He didn't get a second chance to change his mind." Azael swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly. "This isn't about what's right or wrong," she continued, her voice firm but not unkind. "It's about whether or not you want to be standing when it's over." For a long moment he didn't say anything. He just stood there, his body tense, his thoughts caught between what he had been taught and the reality standing in front of him now. Then, slowly, he nodded. Not because he wanted to, but because he knew she wasn't wrong. Zariah reached into the drawer beside her and pulled out a small knife, flipping it in her palm before offering it to him, handle first. He hesitated only for a second before taking it, his fingers wrapping around the grip. his touch uncertain. "We start now," she said simply, and they did. For the next hour, she walked him through every step, every technique, her patience unwavering as she corrected his stance, his grip, the way he positioned his feet. She taught him how to hold the knife, how to move with it instead of against it, how to strike where it would do the most damage. He wasn't fast at first, wasn't precise, but he was learning. His muscles tensed in the right places, his movements grew sharper, his hesitation didn't last as long. Then she moved on to hand-to-hand combat, showing him how to break a grip, how to throw his weight in the right direction, how to use an attacker's strength against them. He struggled with some of it, frustration flickering across his face every time he missed a step or got caught off guard. But he didn't stop, didn't walk away. By the time they were done, sweat had formed along his brow, his breath coming heavier than before, his body still adjusting to the effort. He stared down at his hands, flexing his fingers slightly. The weight of what he was learning settling into his bones. Zariah watched him, waiting, giving him the space to absorb everything. When he finally looked up at her, something in his face had shifted. He wasn't ready yet. Not fully, but he would be. She nodded once before turning back toward the kitchen, her voice calm, steady, but carrying something firm beneath it. "They're coming back," she said, placing a hand against the cool steel of the shotgun resting against the counter. "And when they do, we'll be ready." Azael didn't hesitate this time. He nodded. The night had settled into an eerie stillness, the kind that stretched across the streets like a warning, too quiet, too heavy, as if the entire world had taken a breath and was waiting for something to snap. Zariah sat near the window, her Glock within reach, her muscles coiled with an alertness that would not fade, her body still aching from the fight before, but refusing to acknowledge the pain. She had felt it all day, a sense of inevitability pressing at the edges of her thoughts, the certainty that they weren't done with her, that this wasn't over, that they wouldn't let what had happened stand. She had waited for it, anticipated it, and now, as the faint crunch of tires on pavement reached her ears, she knew the moment had come. The sound was distant at first, barely noticeable, but the longer she listened, the clearer it became. Engines humming low, car doors clicking open, the heavy scrape of boots against gravel as men moved in coordinated silence. They weren't here to scare her anymore. They weren't here to leave threats on her doorstep. This time, they were here to kill. She moved before they reached the house, her body fluid despite the pain, her hands steady as she signaled Azael from across the hall. He was already watching, his breathing controlled but not quite even, his hands clenched into fists, his posture stiff, but his eyes sharp. He was afraid, but he was ready. "They're here," he said quietly, his voice barely above a breath. Zariah gave a single nod as she gestured toward the back of the house, her tone calm, unwavering. "Take position. Stay low. Move only when you need to." Azael hesitated for only a second before he disappeared into the darkness of the hallway, his steps light, his presence barely a whisper as he melted into the shadows. The first noise came from the back door, the unmistakable sound of wood splintering under pressure, a sharp, deliberate crack as someone forced their way in. Zariah exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the grip of her pistol, her body bracing as she heard the shuffle of movement just beyond the threshold. And then the first trap snapped. A wire, stretched low across the entrance, caught the intruder at the ankle, sending him crashing forward with a startled grunt, his body slamming into the kitchen floor. He barely had time to register what had happened before Zariah stepped into view, her weapon already raised, her aim precise as she fired a single shot straight into his knee. The scream that tore from his throat was raw, pain-laced, his body jerking violently as he reached for his leg, his gun slipping from his fingers and skidding across the tiles. The second man surged through the door behind him, moving fast, thinking he could catch her off guard. But she had anticipated that too. As he lunged forward, she pivoted sharply, grabbing a thick metal rod she had wedged against the doorway and swinging it with every ounce of force she had. The impact was brutal, the solid weight of steel colliding against his ribs with a sickening crack. He let out a strangled gasp, stumbling, his balance thrown, and she capitalized on it instantly, stepping forward and grabbing him by the collar before driving his skull against the edge of the kitchen counter. He hit the ground hard and did not get back up. A second later, the front door exploded inward, the wood splintering as a heavy boot crashed through it. Two more men rushed in, their weapons raised, their faces twisted in anticipation, but they didn't make it far before Azael's trap triggered. The nails hidden beneath the welcome mat drove deep into the sole of the first man's boot, and the agonized yell that followed was sharp, visceral, the kind of pain that was instant and unforgiving. He staggered forward, barely able to catch himself, his hands reaching instinctively for his injured foot, giving Azael just enough time to swing the broken chair leg he had been holding like a club, the wood connecting with a solid, meaty crack against the side of the man's skull. He crumpled instantly, his body hitting the floor with a heavy thud. The second intruder, the one still standing, barely had time to react before Zariah was already moving, crossing the distance between them in 3 quick strides. She slammed her palm into his wrist, knocking the gun from his grasp, then stepped into his space, grabbed the front of his jacket, and drove her knee into his gut with enough force to double him over. As he gasped for air, she finished it with a sharp, calculated strike to the temple, sending him collapsing into the broken remains of the coffee table. For a moment, the house was still again, filled only with the sounds of groans and labored breathing, the scent of blood and sweat mixing thick in the air. And then, from the doorway, a familiar voice spoke. "Kailani." Zariah turned toward the entrance, her pulse steady, despite the sharp ache blooming deep in her ribs. Severin Audric stood just inside the threshold, his body braced, but his smirk firmly in place, his eyes cold as they swept across the wreckage in front of him. The bruises from their last fight were still fresh on his face, the way he favored his injured leg barely noticeable, but she saw it, saw the slight shift in his weight, the way his fingers flexed at his sides, already anticipating the next move. He let his gaze roam across the scene, the fallen men, the overturned furniture, the blood smeared against the floorboards, before exhaling, shaking his head slightly. "You've made a real mess of things," he muttered, his tone almost amused, despite the situation. Zariah didn't lower her gun. She didn't speak, didn't move, just watched him carefully, waiting, feeling the shift in the air, the way tension settled deep into her bones. Severin tilted his head slightly, rolling his shoulders back before taking another step inside. "You really think this changes anything?" he asked, his voice smooth, slow, measured. "You think Ronan's just gonna let this go? You think this ends with you still standing?" Zariah's grip on her weapon tightened, but she said nothing, her stance unmoving. Behind her, she could hear Azael shifting slightly, his breathing even, his presence steady. He was waiting too. Severin exhaled sharply, his lips pressing into a thin line. And then, without warning, he moved. The strike was fast, precise, a sharp arc of motion as his hand lashed out, knocking the gun from her grip before she could fire. Before she could recover, he followed through with a brutal punch across her jaw, the impact rattling through her skull, knocking her off balance. Pain flared through her body, but she didn't fall. She caught herself, steadied, adjusted. She struck back without hesitation, her fist colliding with his ribs, a clean, controlled hit. But Severin didn't stumble the way the others had. He absorbed it, barely reacting before retaliating with a sharp, vicious elbow to her injured side. A sharp burst of pain exploded through her ribs, her breath catching as her vision flickered for half a second. It was enough. Severin grabbed her by the throat, his grip like iron, and slammed her into the wall. Her lungs burned as she struggled against the hold, her fingers clawing at his arm, her body twisting as she fought to break free, but his grip only tightened, his face close enough that she could feel his breath against her skin. "You're not walking out of this," he muttered. Her vision blurred at the edges, but she still had one last move. She reached up, fingers finding the small knife she had hidden in the strap of her tank top, and without hesitation, she drove it deep into his shoulder. Severin roared in pain, his grip loosening immediately as he stumbled back, blood already dripping down his arm. But before she could move, before she could take advantage, she heard a choked sound from behind her. Azael. She turned just in time to see Severin grab him, dragging him back, locking an arm around his throat. He was cornered, and Severin had the knife now. Severin's grip on Azael was firm, his arm wrapped tightly around the boy's throat, his stance low and controlled, even with the fresh wound bleeding into his shirt. His breath came short and sharp, his body still adjusting to the pain of the knife wound Zariah had given him, but his strength remained, his hold unshaken, his smirk unwavering despite the red streaks running down his forearm. Azael thrashed against the grip, his hands clawing at Severin's arm, trying to find leverage, trying to break free. But Severin only tightened his hold, dragging him a step backward, making sure Zariah saw every moment of it. He adjusted the grip on the knife in his free hand, turning the blade slightly, just enough to press the cold steel against the side of Azael's throat, just enough to make his breathing hitch. "Well, look at this," Severin murmured, his voice thick with amusement, his tone carrying the lazy arrogance of a man who thought he had already won, the little boy who thought he was a fighter. He tilted his head slightly, his smirk growing as he glanced at Zariah, who had pushed herself to her feet, her body coiled with tension, her stance braced despite the way she was favoring her injured side. "I gotta hand it to you, Kalani. Kid lasted longer than I expected. Thought for sure he'd fold the moment things got real." Azael clenched his teeth, his fingers tightening around Severin's wrist, his breath coming in shallow bursts. His body screamed at him to fight back, to lash out, to do anything other than freeze. But the blade against his skin made every movement feel dangerous, made every twitch of his muscles feel like the wrong choice. Severin chuckled under his breath, his grip shifting slightly as he spoke again. "This is what happens when you act bigger than you are, kid. You step into a fight that ain't yours. You get crushed under the weight of it. You think you're a man now? You think landing one lucky hit makes you something?" His voice dipped lower, a condescending murmur. "Nah, you're still just a scared little boy waiting for someone to come save you." Azael's jaw tightened, his breath pushing through his nose in short, controlled bursts. But his mind was racing, thinking, calculating, adjusting. Severin thought he had control. Severin thought he had already won, and that was his mistake. Azael had spent his whole life in this house, memorizing every creak in the floorboards, every shift in the walls, every narrow space where movement was limited. He knew that Severin was standing too close to the hallway archway, that his back was nearly against the edge of the doorframe, that if he shifted even slightly, he'd lose some of his balance. So he used it. Instead of pulling away, instead of fighting against Severin's grip with strength alone, he twisted into it, forcing Severin to compensate for the movement, forcing him to shift his weight onto his bad leg. The instant he felt Severin's balance waver, he slammed his heel down onto the top of Severin's foot, hard and precise, forcing his stance to break just enough. Severin grunted, his grip faltering for a fraction of a second. But it was enough. Azael shoved backward, using his full weight to slam Severin against the sharp edge of the hallway entrance, the impact forcing the air from his lungs, the knife jerking slightly away from Azael's throat. He didn't hesitate. Azael threw his head back, smashing the back of his skull into Severin's nose. The wet crunch was immediate. Severin let out a strangled curse, his grip breaking completely, his body lurching backward, his free hand snapping up to cover his face as blood poured between his fingers. Azael spun before he could recover, dropping low, grabbing one of the metal rods Zariah had wedged against the wall, the same one she had used earlier, and with every ounce of strength left in him, he swung. The blow connected hard against Severin's ribs, the impact reverberating up Azael's arms, sending Severin staggering sideways, his injured leg failing to support him. He hit the wall with a grunt, the knife slipping from his grip, clattering onto the hardwood floor. He coughed once, his breath heavy, his body barely holding itself up. But Azael didn't wait, didn't hesitate. He had made that mistake once before. He stepped forward, gripping the rod with both hands, ready to swing again. But Zariah was already there. Severin barely had time to react before her fist drove into his ribs with a brutal, precise force, knocking him back against the wall once more, his body barely upright. He gasped for breath, but she didn't give him the chance to recover, didn't give him space to even register the next attack before she struck again, this time with a sharp, controlled elbow to his already broken nose. Severin's head snapped backward, his body sinking down, his legs buckling beneath him. He gasped, blood spilling from his mouth, his breathing ragged, his hands twitching weakly at his sides, as if still trying to push himself back up. Loomed over him, her breath slow, deliberate, her body aching from every hit she had taken, but her stance strong, unwavering. She knelt down slightly, her fingers wrapping around the knife he had dropped, her movements steady, her grip firm. Severin barely lifted his head, his dazed eyes struggling to focus on her, his body no longer fighting, no longer resisting, just a mass of pain and failure slumped against the wall. Zariah exhaled, turning the knife in her grip, her voice low, steady, unwavering. "You came into my home," she said, her tone carrying no anger, no malice, just cold certainty. "You put your hands on my son." She pressed the blade against his collarbone, just enough to make him suck in a sharp breath. "You're lucky I'm letting you leave at all." Severin tried to say something, his mouth opening slightly, but the words never made it past his lips before she drove her knee into his ribs one final time, knocking him fully onto the floor. His body collapsed, his head hitting the ground, his limbs too weak to support him anymore. He was still breathing, still conscious, but only barely. Zariah straightened, tossing the knife aside, letting it clatter against the floor as she turned to Azael. He was still gripping the metal rod, his breathing heavy, his fingers tight around the handle, his knuckles white from the pressure. He looked at Severin's body on the floor, then up at her, his eyes still carrying the weight of everything that had just happened. But there was something else there too. He wasn't afraid anymore. She nodded once. Silent acknowledgement, silent understanding. Then she looked toward the doorway, listening, waiting, making sure that no one else was coming, that there were no more footsteps in the dark. When she was certain, she finally let herself breathe. The house was eerily quiet now, the kind of silence that comes after a storm, heavy with the weight of everything that had just happened. The scent of blood lingered in the air, mixing with the acrid tang of sweat and gunpowder. But Zariah barely noticed it. She stood in the center of her living room, her body aching, her ribs bruised, her knuckles raw. But she was still standing. And more importantly, they weren't. Severin was still slumped on the floor, barely conscious, his breath shallow, his body curled in on itself as his mind tried to catch up to the pain he had endured. The others, his men, his crew, the ones who had come into her home thinking they would walk out of it victorious, were either unconscious, groaning in pain, or too weak to lift themselves off the ground. Some lay sprawled across the floor, others outside in the dirt, their bodies motionless except for the slow rise and fall of their chests. Their arrogance had failed them in the end, their overconfidence shattered along with their pride. Azael stood beside her, his chest rising and falling heavily, his grip still firm around the metal rod he had used to take down Severin. He looked exhausted but steady, his body no longer shaking, his gaze sharp, hardened by the reality of what he had just done. He had faced it. He had survived. The distant wail of sirens cut through the silence, growing louder as they approached. It wasn't the first time law enforcement had shown up too late, and it wouldn't be the last. Zariah exhaled, already knowing what was coming. Sheriff Baylor arrived first, stepping out of his cruiser with the same slow, deliberate pace he always had, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. The other officers who followed moved quickly, their eyes darting between the bodies scattered around the property, their hands resting near their weapons, as if unsure of what they had just walked into. Baylor took a long look at the scene before him, his gaze lingering on Severin's bloodied form before flicking toward Zariah, his mouth pressing into a tight line, his lips parting as if he were about to speak. But then he hesitated, and that was his first mistake. He wasn't in control here. Not anymore. Still, he sighed, shaking his head like she had just made his life more difficult. Like she was the problem in all of this. Like this wasn't the natural consequence of everything he had allowed to fester in the shadows of this town. "Well," he muttered, adjusting his belt, his tone carrying that same condescension she had heard before, the same slow, deliberate drawl of a man who believed he could spin the narrative in whatever way suited him. "This sure looks bad for you." Zariah didn't move. She didn't flinch. She just stared at him, waiting, letting him dig himself deeper. Baylor clicked his tongue, nodding toward the bodies. "Now, I don't doubt that these men broke in. Looks like self-defense at first glance. But you really went overboard here, Kailani. That's a lot of damage. A lot of injured men. You think the town's gonna like seeing this?" Azael stiffened beside her, his fingers tightening around the rod again. But Zariah lifted a hand slightly, stopping him before he could react. She wasn't worried. Not anymore, because she had proof. She let the silence stretch just long enough for Baylor to feel confident in his assumption, just long enough for him to believe that this was another moment where his authority would override reality. Then, finally, she moved. Reaching into her back pocket, she pulled out her phone, tapped the screen once, and held it up for him to see. The footage played instantly. The neighbor's security camera had caught everything. The gang arriving, weapons in hand, forcing their way inside, moving through the house like predators intent on tearing apart everything in their path. It had caught them breaking through the doors, heard the threats, seen the violence unfold in real time. Every kick, every punch, every moment of brutality. It was all there, recorded, clear, undeniable, and most importantly, not once did she attack first. Baylor's smirk faltered. The officers standing behind him shifted slightly, exchanging glances. Some of them had already seen enough. They had known for years what men like Severin and Ronan were capable of, had turned a blind eye more times than they could count. But now, there was evidence, and no amount of authority, no amount of power plays, could make that go away. Zariah held his gaze, her voice calm, unwavering. "I don't think the town's gonna have a problem with me, Sheriff." She tilted her head slightly, letting the words settle. "I think they're gonna have a problem with you." Baylor exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening, his fingers twitching at his sides. He wasn't a stupid man. He knew when the tide had turned. Behind him, more lights flickered down the street. More cops, more people stepping out onto their porches, more whispers spreading. The town was waking up, and for the first time, they were seeing everything. He let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders before offering her one last look, one that carried something closer to resentment than authority now. "You just made a lot of enemies tonight?" Zariah didn't blink. "No." Her voice was quiet, steady, absolute. "I ended them." Baylor studied her for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned toward his men, his stance stiff, his movements rigid, as if the weight of what was happening had finally settled onto his shoulders. And just like that, his hold on this town slipped. One by one, the officers turned away from him, their attention shifting to Zariah instead, to the truth they had ignored for too long, to the woman who had fought back when no one else had. The news would spread by morning. The town would talk, and by the end of the week, Baylor would be out. The world he had controlled for years was finally collapsing beneath him, and Zariah Kaylani was still standing. The morning air was crisp, the scent of sawdust and fresh paint blending with the warmth of the sun rising over the horizon. For the first time in what felt like weeks, the tension that had settled over the house had begun to lift. The suffocating weight of what had happened slowly unraveling with every nail hammered into place, every shattered board replaced, every wall scrubbed clean of the violence that had unfolded. Within them, Zariah stood on the front porch, watching as a group of local workers, neighbors, and even a few unfamiliar faces moved around the property, repairing what had been destroyed. The broken door had already been removed, a new one waiting to be installed. The windows, which had been left cracked from the fight, were being replaced one by one. The blood-stained floorboards in the living room had been torn up, soon to be swapped out for something new. She hadn't asked for help, but after the sheriff was forced out, after the truth about the town's corruption had spread, after Severin and his gang were taken away in cuffs, something had changed. People who had once kept their distance now stood with her. They had seen what had happened, had witnessed what she had been forced to endure, and they had decided, without words, without questions, that she wouldn't rebuild alone. Azael was near the driveway, helping an older man load scraps of wood into the back of a truck, his movements steady, his stance firm. He didn't flinch when someone spoke to him, didn't hesitate when asked to do something. His hands, once trembling after the fight, no longer shook. Zariah had seen the change in him before he even realized it himself. It wasn't just confidence. It was certainty. He had stood his ground. He had fought, and now, for the first time, he knew he could. She stepped down from the porch, making her way toward him as he wiped the back of his hand across his forehead, sweat forming along his brow from the work. He glanced up when she approached, his eyes meeting hers, something quiet but strong beneath them. "You did good," she said, her voice steady, deliberate. She didn't say it to comfort him or to soften what had happened. She said it because it was true. "You're stronger than you think." Azael didn't respond right away. He exhaled, nodding slightly, his fingers tightening around the edge of the truck bed as he processed the words. When he finally spoke, his voice was different than it had been before. Not hesitant, not uncertain, but sure. "I know." Zariah studied him for a moment longer before nodding, a small, knowing look passing between them before she reached out, clapping a firm hand on his shoulder. He had grown, not just in skill, not just in the ability to fight, but in the way he carried himself, in the way he looked at the world now, and she knew that no matter what came next, he wouldn't run from it. The sound of hammering echoed in the background, a rhythm of rebuilding, of moving forward, of turning something broken into something whole again. The house had been a battleground. Now, it would be a home again. The repairs continued long after the last of the debris had been cleared, long after the broken windows had been replaced and the door had been reinforced, long after the workers and volunteers had packed up their tools and left. But even as the physical scars on the house faded, the memory of what had happened remained, lingering in the air like an unspoken truth. The town had changed. People watched them differently now, their gazes lingering a little too long whenever Zariah and Azael walked down the street, their whispers just barely audible when they passed. Some of them still kept their distance, their expressions carefully neutral, their smiles too thin, their conversations cutting off the moment Zariah stepped too close. They weren't openly hostile, weren't bold enough to say what they really thought, but their silence spoke volumes. Others, though, had shifted in a different way. The cashier at the grocery store no longer hesitated before greeting her, no longer offered forced politeness wrapped in condescension. The man at the gas station, the one who had never looked her in the eye before, gave her a small nod when she stopped to fill up her tank. It wasn't friendship, wasn't acceptance, but it was something. a quiet respect, a recognition that she wasn't an outsider anymore. And then there was Morris Lawton. Zariah had expected him to be one of the ones who held on to his resentment the longest. He had been the first to install a security camera when she moved in, the first to make it clear, without ever having to say a word, that he didn't trust her, that he didn't believe she belonged. That camera had always been aimed toward her house, an ever-present reminder that he was watching, waiting for her to prove him right. But today, as she stood on her porch, a cold bottle of water in hand, she watched as he climbed a ladder beside his garage, his old, weathered hands working to unscrew the rusted bolts holding that camera in place. He didn't look in her direction, didn't acknowledge that she was standing there, but she knew that he knew she was watching. Azael stepped up beside her, following her gaze toward the ladder, his brows furrowing slightly as he took in what was happening. "Is he really?" Zariah didn't respond. She just watched as Morris finished unscrewing the last bolt, pulling the camera free from its mount. He held it for a moment, staring at it, something unreadable in his expression. Then, without ceremony, he tossed it into the garbage bin beside him. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a peace offering. It was an acknowledgement. He knew now what the rest of the town did. They weren't leaving. Zariah exhaled, the corner of her mouth lifting slightly, a breath of something that wasn't quite amusement, but wasn't anger either. "Guess we don't have to wave at the camera anymore," Azael murmured. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she let out a quiet chuckle. The town could watch all they wanted. They weren't going anywhere. The remnants of the gang had been swept away one by one. The town had seen the truth. The sheriff had been cast out, and the men who had terrorized the streets in shadows now lay broken, either behind bars or too injured to ever be a threat again. But one loose end remained: Severin Audric. The last time she had seen him, he had been barely conscious, bloodied and humiliated, dragged away in cuffs after his men had been rounded up like cattle. But there was something about men like him, men who thrived on control, men who couldn't accept defeat, men who didn't understand when the fight was over. And just as she expected, he had one last thing to say. Zariah stood outside the holding cell of the county jail, separated by cold steel bars and the low hum of flickering overhead lights. The air smelled like bleach and damp concrete, the kind of sterile environment that made the walls feel closer than they actually were. Severin sat on the bench inside, his body hunched slightly, his hands cuffed in front of him. His face was a mess of bruises, his left eye swollen shut, his lips cracked and split from the repeated beatings he had endured. His leg was wrapped tight, the injury she had given him making it impossible for him to even stand properly. But somehow, he was still smirking. His voice came out hoarse, raw from the damage he had taken. But the malice was still there, the stubborn belief that he still held some power, some control, some way to make this all go his way. "You think this ends here?" he rasped, leaning forward slightly, his good eye locking onto hers with something that was both weak and defiant. "You think because you took me down, because you put my men in the dirt, that it's over?" His lip curled slightly, even as he winced from the movement. "You don't get it, do you?" Zariah said nothing. She just watched. Severin chuckled under his breath, a dry, humorless sound that barely made it past his busted lips. "I've bled for this town longer than you've been here. There's always someone willing to step in, someone ready to take over, someone who remembers what we built and wants a piece of it. You think you stopped anything? You just made room for worse men to come in." Zariah exhaled slowly, taking a step closer to the bars, her gaze unwavering. "You think you're still in charge, Severin?" Her voice was quiet, steady, unshaken. "You think you still have power?" Severin's smirk didn't waver, but there was something behind his eyes now: doubt. Zariah leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make sure he felt every word. "You were never the one calling the shots." The words landed harder than any punch. Severin's jaw tensed, the muscles twitching, his fingers curling slightly as the weight of the truth settled in, because he knew exactly what she meant. He had never been the one in charge. Not really. He had spent his entire life following his brother, cleaning up after him, being the second in command in a gang that wasn't his. Ronan was the one who built the fear. Ronan was the one who ran things. Severin had just been the fool who believed he was untouchable. And now, Ronan was next. Zariah straightened, her voice losing any pretense of patience, her stance firm, unshaken, as she locked eyes with Severin, watching the flicker of recognition settle into his battered face. Your brother made the mistake of thinking this town belonged to him, just like you did. She tilted her head slightly, her voice sharp, cutting, deliberate, letting the words settle before delivering the final blow. But I don't see him here. Do you? Severin's smirk finally faltered, because Ronan was gone. Ronan Odric had built his reputation on being untouchable, on running things from the background while men like Severin took the fall for him. He had paid off the right people, had buried evidence, had kept his hands clean while others did his dirty work. But there was one thing he hadn't counted on. Zariah wasn't just here to take down his gang. She was here to end it. She had spent days gathering everything she needed, a meticulous, calculated effort that left no stone unturned. The paper trail of Ronan's dealings, the money he had funneled through shell businesses, the names of the men who had worked under him, the people who had been too afraid to speak before but were finally ready now. Every single detail had been laid out in a way that left him no escape. She knew Ronan would run the moment he realized Severin had lost, and she was waiting for it. The safe house he had chosen was an old cabin hidden deep in the woods, a place he had likely used for years, always knowing that if things went wrong, he'd have a way out. There were no roads leading directly to it, only dirt paths, the kind that made it easy to disappear if you knew what you were doing. But Zariah had been tracking men like him her entire life. She moved through the trees, silent, her body steady despite the ache still settling in her ribs, despite the exhaustion pressing at the edges of her muscles, despite the long, endless nights leading up to this moment. Azael had wanted to come, had insisted on it, but she had told him no. This wasn't his fight. Not anymore. She saw the flicker of movement through the trees first. Ronan, pacing near the front of the cabin, his phone pressed against his ear, his free hand clenched into a fist, his entire body wound tight, his posture screaming frustration, anger, desperation. His car was parked nearby, engine running, packed and ready to go. He was leaving, or at least he thought he was. Zariah moved quickly, closing the distance before he had the chance to notice, her steps controlled, measured, her breath steady as she reached the clearing, watching the way his head turned slightly, his brows pulling together just before she stepped out from the tree line, her gun raised, her voice sharp, unwavering. Drop it. Ronan didn't freeze. Unlike his brother, unlike the others, he didn't hesitate, not immediately. His hand went straight to his gun, fingers curling around the handle. He wasn't going to surrender. He was going to fight his way out. Zariah anticipated it. The moment his fingers twitched, she fired. A sharp, deliberate shot that hit the dirt inches from his boot. The sound cracked through the air, sending birds scattering from the trees. But Ronan didn't flinch, didn't startle the way most men would have. He lunged, not for his gun, but for her. Zariah moved, twisting sharply to the side, barely avoiding the full force of his charge. But Ronan was bigger, heavier, his momentum carrying him forward, slamming into her shoulder, forcing them both backward, her feet slipping against the loose dirt as he drove them toward the side of the cabin. She gritted her teeth, adjusting her stance, pushing back. But Ronan was relentless, his strength fueled by something desperate, something wild, something that told her he wasn't going to stop until one of them was on the ground. She braced herself, twisting her body at the last second, using his own momentum to throw him off balance, sending him stumbling forward. But Ronan was quick, too quick, recovering before she could take advantage, his movements sharp, aggressive, calculated. He swung, a fast, brutal punch aimed at her ribs. She dodged, barely, feeling the wind of it graze her side, but he didn't stop. Another punch, this time aimed higher, toward her jaw, toward something that could slow her down. She blocked, countered, striking back with a sharp elbow to his ribs, a movement fluid, automatic, drilled into her through years of training. Ronan grunted, stepping back, but he didn't slow down. He grabbed at her arm, trying to force her into a grapple, trying to take away her range, but she twisted, driving her knee into his side, forcing space between them, forcing him to react, forcing him to adjust. And still, he kept coming. Zariah exhaled, adjusting her stance, watching the way his breathing had shifted. More labored now, his movements still fast, still powerful, but not as sharp, not as precise. He wasn't trained for this. He was used to fighting from the top. She was used to fighting from the ground. Ronan wiped at his mouth, blood streaking across his knuckles, his jaw tight, his nostrils flaring. "You think this town will ever be yours?" he sneered, voice thick with exhaustion, with frustration, with something else buried beneath it. Something he didn't want her to see. "I built this place. I made these people afraid." Zariah exhaled, rolling her shoulders back, shaking off the ache in her ribs, the exhaustion pressing at the edges of her limbs. "Not anymore." Ronan clenched his jaw, taking a step forward. But this time, his stance wasn't as steady. His confidence wasn't as sure. He knew it now. She wasn't going to break. But that didn't mean he was done. Not yet. He lunged again. But this time, Zariah let him come. She caught him mid-movement, twisted, and used his own weight to send them both crashing through the cabin door. Wood splintered, the impact shaking through her bones as she hit the floor hard. Ronan landing just beside her, and then they both moved. Ronan scrambled toward his gun. Zariah reached for the knife strapped to her thigh. Neither of them were done. The impact of their bodies slamming through the cabin door sent a thunderous crack echoing through the small wooden structure, the hinges barely holding as the door frame splintered apart. The two of them crashed to the floor with the weight of the struggle, rolling hard against the worn wooden planks, dust spilling from the rafters, the room itself seeming to shake under the sheer force of their collision. Zariah hit the ground on her side, the breath momentarily knocked from her lungs, but she recovered almost instantly, rolling onto her knees just as Ronan scrambled to his feet. He was fast, his body reacting before his mind could fully process the shift in the fight, his instincts carrying him forward even as his chest heaved from exertion. His hand darted toward the gun that had been thrown across the floor in the chaos, his fingers stretching toward it, desperate, his entire body lunging in a single explosive movement. Zariah anticipated it. She moved with precision, launching herself forward, her boot slamming into his wrist just as he reached for the weapon, sending it skidding across the floorboards, spinning out of reach before either of them could recover. But Ronan didn't hesitate. He turned that lost momentum into an attack, his other hand shooting up, catching her across the jaw with a brutal strike that snapped her head to the side. The sharp sting of pain flashed through her skull, but she pushed through it, absorbing the hit without breaking focus, her muscles coiling in response rather than retreating from the impact. Ronan took another swing, this one lower, aiming for her ribs, his movements aggressive, controlled, the kind of strikes that came from a man who had fought before, a man who knew how to hurt someone when he wanted to. But she wasn't an easy target. She wasn't someone who crumbled under pressure. She was trained, conditioned, built for fights like this. She dodged at the last second, shifting her weight just enough to let the punch graze past her torso, her hands already reacting, seizing the opportunity. She grabbed his forearm mid-swing, twisting sharply, forcing his elbow into a painful lock that had his body jerking instinctively to break free. She didn't give him the chance. Before he could react, she drove her knee into his ribs, the impact forcing a sharp grunt from his throat. But he still didn't go down. He fought against her grip, twisting hard, breaking the hold with a savage jerk of his arm before countering with a brutal shove, sending her staggering back toward the overturned dining table. She caught herself, one hand bracing against the wood for balance, her pulse steady, her breathing controlled. But Ronan didn't relent. He came at her fast, closing the distance, reaching for the knife she saw gleaming in his boot. The second his fingers wrapped around the handle, Zariah moved. She surged forward, catching his wrist before he could bring the blade up, forcing it downward with both hands, twisting his grip in a controlled, practiced motion, using the angle of his own attack against him. Ronan resisted, teeth clenched, muscles straining, fighting for control. But she had already positioned her body for leverage. With one swift motion, she slammed his wrist against the edge of the table, the impact forcing the knife from his grasp, sending it clattering to the ground. But Ronan wasn't finished. Even without a weapon, he didn't slow down. He yanked his arm free, using the sudden momentum to ram his shoulder into her, driving them both backward, sending her crashing against the wooden beams that framed the cabin walls. The jolt sent a sharp, searing pain through her spine, but she absorbed it, refusing to let it slow her down. The moment Ronan pulled back to swing again, she was already moving, ducking under his strike, twisting behind him before driving her elbow into the back of his head. The force sent him staggering, his balance faltering for the first time. She pressed the advantage. She grabbed him by the collar, pivoted, and slammed him face first into the wall with enough force to send cracks spider-webbing through the old wooden panels. His body lurched from the impact, his hands bracing against the wall for support. But she wasn't done. She spun him around before driving her fist into his stomach, forcing the air from his lungs in a sharp, gasping exhale. Ronan coughed, sputtering, but still, he didn't go down. His chest heaved, his breathing ragged, his hands twitching at his sides as if he were still trying to find an opening, still trying to claw back the control that had already slipped from his grasp. "You think this town will ever be yours?" he rasped, voice thick with pain. But there was still defiance in it, still that arrogance, still that belief that he was untouchable even now. "I built this place. I made these people afraid." Zariah exhaled, slow, even, rolling her shoulders back as she watched him, seeing the way his stance had shifted, the way the fight had started to drain from him even as his pride refused to acknowledge it. "Not anymore," she said simply. Ronan let out a low, bitter laugh, shaking his head, his body sagging slightly against the wall, his breath still coming heavy. But something in his posture had changed. He wasn't lunging anymore. He wasn't reaching for a weapon. He was still standing, still holding himself together. But the reality had settled. He had lost. Zariah took a step closer, lifting her gun, leveling it between his eyes, her expression unreadable, unwavering. "Stay down," she ordered. For a long moment, Ronan just stared at her, his eyes burning with something unreadable, something that still refused to bend. Even as the sirens outside grew louder, the blue and red lights flashing through the cracks in the broken cabin door, his jaw clenched, his nostrils flared, but he didn't move. Not because he wanted to surrender, but because he knew this fight was over. Zariah reached for her radio, never taking her eyes off him. "This is Kaylani. I have him in custody." The static crackled, a voice confirming the response. Sirens grew louder. Footsteps pounded against the wooden porch. The door behind her swung open, the beams creaking under the weight of approaching officers, and for the first time in his life, Ronan Odrick wasn't the one in control. Zariah took a slow step back, her body finally relaxing, her breath steady as she holstered her weapon, watching as Ronan's arms were wrenched behind his back, his wrists locked in cuffs, his body forced down onto his knees. His breathing was heavy, his fingers twitching at his sides as if he still wanted to fight. Still wanted to believe he had a way out, but there was no way out. Not anymore. When they dragged him to his feet, he was no longer a king. No longer a man pulling strings from the shadows. He was just another criminal who had finally run out of places to hide. And Zariah had made sure of that. The town had changed, not in the way that could be measured by new buildings or repaved roads, but in the way people looked at her now, in the way they stood a little straighter when she passed by, in the way their gazes no longer carried suspicion, but something else. Recognition. Respect. It had taken time, but the Audric brothers were gone. Ronan had joined Severin in a jail cell, his long reign of quiet terror collapsing beneath the weight of undeniable proof. The money laundering, the racketeering, the intimidation tactics, the connections that had kept him untouchable for years. It had all been ripped apart piece by piece, exposed in a way that left him no escape. He had fought it, of course. Even as the cuffs snapped around his wrists, even as the last remnants of his crew were rounded up, he had sneered at her, muttering under his breath about how she didn't belong here, how this town would never be hers. But he was wrong, because now it was. She had fought for it. She had won. And she wasn't going anywhere. The irony wasn't lost on her. How they had once dismissed her. How they had whispered about the black single mother moving into their neighborhood, the woman they assumed was weak, alone, vulnerable. They hadn't known who she was. They hadn't known what she was capable of. Zariah Kaylani, former Navy SEAL. She had served her country, fought in places most of these people couldn't even name on a map, survived situations worse than anything Ronan and his men could throw at her. She had come here for a quiet life, for a fresh start, for peace, but when the fight came to her doorstep, she finished it. The recognition ceremony had been Ellen's idea. She had called Zariah one morning, her voice unusually chipper, and insisted, no, demanded, she attend. "You need to be there," she had said, and when Zariah tried to protest, she had cut her off with, "You didn't fight that war just to go back into hiding." So she went. It had been a simple gathering, nothing grand, just a group of people standing outside the community hall. People who had once avoided her, once whispered behind her back, once kept their distance, but were now standing here, acknowledging her. They had made her president of the neighborhood council. At first, she had nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. The same people who had once watched her with wary eyes, who had treated her as an outsider, were now placing her in a position of leadership. But as she stood there, shaking hands, listening as Ellen spoke about the town's future and the importance of safety, she realized it wasn't just a title. It was a statement. They were saying, in their own quiet way, that she had earned her place here, that she had done what no one else had, stood up, fought back, and won. She had built this home with her own hands. She had nearly lost it, but now it was truly hers. As the evening light faded and people dispersed, Ellen lingered, giving Zariah a knowing look before shaking her head with a small smirk. "Didn't think you'd ever be running neighborhood meetings, did you?" Zariah exhaled, a small chuckle escaping her lips. "Not in a million years." Ellen crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. "But you're staying." Zariah didn't hesitate. "Yeah," she said, looking around at the town, at the people who had once been strangers, but were now something more. "I'm staying." The sun was warm against Zariah's skin as she and Azael walked through the park, the late morning air crisp, carrying the sound of rustling leaves and distant laughter from a group of kids near the playground. It was an ordinary day, the kind of day that once felt impossible, the kind of day that didn't feel like waiting for the next fight. Azael walked beside her, his backpack slung over one shoulder, his movements relaxed, steady. It had only been a few weeks since everything had ended, but she could see the change in him, not just in the way he carried himself, more assured, more certain, but in the way he looked at the world now. He had faced fear, fought through it, survived. And yet, despite all of it, he was still himself. "You sure you don't want to ride?" she asked, glancing over at him as they strolled along the paved path. Bus stops a few blocks the other way. Azael smirked. I can walk. Not like I can't handle myself. Zariah chuckled, shaking her head. Cocky now, huh? Not cocky, he said, tossing a small stone from the path into the grass. Just different. Zariah didn't argue. He was different. Not hardened, not cold, but stronger. He wasn't looking over his shoulder anymore. They reached the edge of the park, where the sidewalk stretched toward town, and Azael slowed slightly, adjusting the strap of his backpack. You good? She asked. He nodded, stuffing his hands into his hoodie pocket. Yeah, a pause. Then, you? Zariah exhaled, glancing up at the sky for a moment before looking back at him. Yeah, and for the first time in a long while, she meant it. The town hadn't forgotten what had happened. It probably never would. Some people still watched them from a distance, still whispered when they thought no one could hear. But she wasn't running. She and Azael belonged here. The past was behind them, and the future was theirs to own. Go on. She nudged his arm. Don't be late. Azael smirked, taking a step back toward the street. See you later, Mom. Zariah watched him go, his stride easy, his head held high. He had survived. He had won, and so had she. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the pavement beneath her feet, she took one last breath of the fresh, quiet morning. Then she turned and walked forward. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have hand-picked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.